So my talk today is about a water-sensitive society, and I'm not speaking here in terms of what's currently happening, just in terms of what we know in the water sector for South Africa. So from a research driver perspective, we find that a lot of our work is actually linked to 5 key areas. So essentially population growth, so understanding within South Africa, in terms of the coverage, what are the demands. Industrialization poses specific problems. We know industrialization has to occur for jobs and improved wealth, but we also know with it comes a consumption of resources and also a deterioration of the environment. In terms of urbanization, is a particularly interesting problem for South Africa because in many of our cities we're not dense enough. We essentially have massive amounts of urban sprawl, and so we don't actually get the economies of scale that sometimes is required around some of the services. And so this poses a particularly huge dilemma for some of the planners within the sector. And then the 2 key things at the end is around the limitation of natural resources and the changes to the natural environment, linked to both in terms of what we have available in South Africa, but also what is going to happen in terms of the changing climate. So if we look at South Africa, very often we hear our planners complain because they say, well, we've got informal settlements, people are migrating too quickly. But if we really look at it in the grand context of the global world, we'll find that South Africa has fairly small cities in terms of how we are evolving at the moment. We are essentially moving to a 50 to 75% urbanization, which is the general trend as we move towards a developed world situation. But we also see that in terms of our growth rate, we're essentially between 1% and 2%. So we're not growing as fast as some of the African cities, for example. And so while it is a problem in terms of the migration and planning, it is actually a problem that is more often than not stabilized in terms of population growth rate. In terms of climate change, we'll find that South Africa, at least we're actually on the right trajectory. So from a politician's point of view, I think as scientists we are saying the politicians are taking us seriously, unlike some countries. I won't name the big country that we're talking about where there are climate change deniers, but I think here in this country we have done quite a bit of modeling. We do know that the western part of the country is going to get drier. We also know that the eastern part of the country is going to get wetter and have more variable weather. So from a policy point of view, I think while we're not there yet, at least we're in the right direction. I think the bigger challenge will come around the implementation of how we arrange for this. From a water point of view in terms of South Africa, you'll find that we are considered a water scarce country, so we're not water stressed. I mean, in terms of the numbers out there, we are essentially less than 1,000 meter cubed per capita per year. So as a country, from a physical environment point of view, we do have issues, and it is not related to politics and essentially, other aspects. There are compounding effects, obviously, in terms of the amount of water we have available, but we are essentially a water-scarce country. So water in South Africa in our current context. So from a legislative environment point of view, we're governed by 2 major acts. If you're in the water sector, the Water Act and the Water Services Act. I think what's important here to understand is there is no ownership of water in South Africa. In other countries there is, but we do have the right to use water but not to own water. And there are several principles that are in these documents, and just a couple of things that I'd like to raise. Firstly, we are aiming to achieve an equitable access for all. We're also aiming to achieve sustainability through efficiency and effectiveness. We must understand that the priority is given to basic human needs and to the ecological reserve. So water is used first as a common good, but also as an economic good. And so there's these trade-offs that has to be made. From who are the actors in the space, obviously the Department of Water Affairs is the primary sort of custodian of water in the water sector. But there are a number of players that play in the management role around various sectors. So there's the water boards, there's local government or the water sector institutions, there's CMAs. From a physical environment point of view, we essentially get around 400 millimeters annual rainfall across the country. The issue is not necessarily that number, but basically in terms of our variability of distribution. So you can get less than 200 millimeters per year to 800 millimeters, which is the global average. So across the country, we have this variation across in terms of our mean annual rainfall. There's also a seasonal distribution. So across the country, you'll find that if you're going to get summer rain, it's going to occur in a very specific period between, say, 2 to 3 months. And so you actually have to store in those 2 to 3 months. If you don't store, then you're in trouble. If those rains come late, then you're in trouble, as we are seeing, as we saw recently, both in the Eastern Cape and now we're seeing in KwaZulu-Natal. As a hot country, we also have high evaporation rates, so which means that a lot of our water is lost to evaporation, and this also poses additional issues. So from a management environment, South Africa has traditionally always managed water by interbasin transfers. So many people in South Africa talk about water assurance, and you open your tap and you get water, but really it is a sort of a false sense of water security. It's an engineered solution that allows you to have this water that comes out of your taps. And essentially we have about 790 large dams, and about 2/3 of our mean annual runoff is actually captured in those dams. So if the rains don't fall, we don't actually get those numbers. And what this means is that the Department of Water Affairs, and together with the other management agencies, actually transfer water through quite an energy-intensive system model. So they transfer water to areas where we actually require it. From a planning environment, what we do know from a surface water point of view, which supplies about 77% of our water currently, 98% is already allocated. We know from a groundwater point of view, we use about 9%. I think there are numbers that vary around that because it could be between 10 billion to 7.5 billion that is currently available for use. And then also we do a lot of what we call indirect reuse, which is 30 to 60% of our return flows, especially in the inland areas, tend to be put back into the system and basically taken up again, abstracted, purified, and then used. The numbers that you're speaking about here, or was used for planning here, is from a Water Resource 2005 study. And currently we're in the process of updating that at the Water Research Commission, and there will be a WR 2012, which is due to finish around 2016. So we'll actually have a new set of numbers available for the country. In terms of water use, we typically see these numbers, and we have what I call sometimes, probably not the right discussions around these numbers, but agriculture, we say, uses about, or is allocated about 60% of the water. Mining, power generation, industry, between 8 to 9% of the water. And then water basically for municipal, or what we call human consumption needs, is linked to about 27%. I think the more important thing to understand from a South African perspective is based on what is available, which is the blue blocks, to what is required, which is your demand. We essentially have no fat in the system. So we as a country have to get much smarter about managing water and managing complexity around water, rather than actually, continue to have the blame game. Because I think water is a common good, but we're all in this together. So what do we know? We know basically that South Africa's demand will be 17% more than exists in 2030. And this number is almost doubled if we start taking across the country from a climate change perspective. But we also know with a decrease in these sort of hydrological flows in our system will come an increase in water quality deterioration. So we're already starting to map some of these things out, which has led to sort of new government regulations around waste discharge charge systems linked to specific parameters in certain areas that will get worse and worse. The good news, though, is that more recently, we've seen that industry has also highlighted the water crisis. So up until about, say, 2011, industry really didn't think water was an issue. It's only recently that they actually started to put water crisis, and in 2015, it became the #1 business risk. So from a South African context, we largely deal with water from transfers to surface water and groundwater, and a little bit on the inland side around what we call recharge. But the truth is we have to actually get better, and it is context-specific and site-specific around mine water treatment, around seawater desalination, around wastewater reclamation, rainwater harvesting, stormwater harvesting, and in terms of storage, aquifer recharge and grey water use. So it's actually now moving from what we call a single source, largely a single source supply, to a more diversified supply of the future. But we must understand one thing, that with this will come increases in cost. And so that's a conversation as a society we must be willing to engage with. Because if one looks at desalination, which is currently the most costly in terms of the rands per kiloliter. So that's the extreme, and the dam is the other extreme. And so in between will come a whole range of sort of cost options for us in future. So the way we've looked at this is in terms of South Africa, we actually need to start setting a much more progressive image. And if one looks at the way cities are developed or built environments are planned, we tend to plan cities around supply hydraulics first, followed by sewage treatment, followed by drainage. In South Africa, largely, most of our cities are what we call drain cities. And where we've got informal or peri-urban spaces, we're actually not even at a drain city stage. We're somewhere in between supply hydraulics and basically sewage treatment. But the idea is that in future, we should actually move to the sort of, we should move to the more adaptive sort of multifunctional infrastructure. And with this comes an important point. It's around the way we plan for infrastructure and the kind of timing that we use. So currently we do things in a much more short time. So we don't actually look at 50 to 100 years planning around our infrastructure. And the way we can actually move that forward is actually to have a more long-term space. The added complexity for South Africa, obviously, is while some of our cities are following the natural linear trajectory, a lot of our city spaces are not yet developed. So there's a lot of what we call informal areas. And the opportunity, therefore, exists in those spaces to do the long-term planning sort of decision-making, and so to leapfrog around how we actually do multifunctional water infrastructure for the future. So from a research perspective, we're currently looking at alternate sources. We're looking at yields. We're looking at technologies to treat water to fit for purpose, and therefore setting the correct water quality objectives. And we do this in a number of ways, using models, using transdisciplinary approaches, looking at scenarios, technologies, demonstrators, and the impact analysis of this. Ultimately, whether we plan for a city, a village, a town, or a settlement, we actually have to ask ourselves, how are we measuring our water balance within those cities? And the cities themselves should be seen as capture areas. And we should never really be looking at a water in, water out scenario, but rather sort of a recycling within a city. So in the future, and I think a lot of people spoke about this, it's really about the green space, so homes where we talk about stormwater harvesting and rainwater gardens and rainwater storage tanks and a range of other things. And I'm looking at it from a water perspective. Obviously, you've got to add on the energy component, resource efficiency on that. In terms of large spaces, we're also looking at where you're building new buildings. So rather than retrofitting, the new buildings and new building regulations that look at sort of grey water reuse, rainwater storage, and how to create more green spaces. And the importance of the green spaces is really around the climate change aspects of the 2 to 3 degree prediction of an increase in temperature. So by creating these microclimates, the opportunity exists to actually start to create cooler environments within cities. And this has been shown in external studies of, say, Las Vegas, where it was largely built environments. And if you start to put more and more sort of green environments in there, the temperature of that area sort of drops. So the same, again, in terms of common spaces. So currently in South Africa, we do a lot of permeable paving, but we don't do storage. We don't do storage and recycle and reuse of some of those environments. And we've done quite a bit of case studies around what's going on. So aspects of sustainable urban drainage are being taken out, but they're not necessarily being taken up completely. So here again, it's the same concept of basically creating highway islands. So currently we build roads where we try and move water away, and that's to prevent flooding. But the idea is that within that flooding context also comes an opportunity for harvesting. So models currently in use are starting to look and give us some sort of direction on how to do some of the feasibility assessment of what to do for cities, because there are different contexts. So if one looks at end-use modeling, for example, this was a simple study that was done, where you look at, say, rainwater harvesting and grey water harvesting, you can see almost a 50% sort of savings of water across different cities. Of course, we have to start unpacking some of that, the data, because data is one of the critical aspects when one does modeling. So the idea is that eventually in South Africa, in order to move to water-sensitive cities, we will have new taps. New taps basically meaning new water sources, but within that we will develop what we call the blue-green sort of infrastructure. But we can't do any of this without building resilience around management, adapting to change, and good governance models that allow and enable for this to occur. And I think eThekwini is a great example of where they're looking at opportunities for resource recovery, so trying to maximize the value out of almost all their systems. So there are aspects where South Africa is doing little things. It's now really about pulling it together to get the sort of the impact of the integration. So I think ultimately one has to say we are a water scarce country, and the only way we can actually move ahead is through managing our systems through highly skilled individuals, so building our sort of human capacity in that area. But we need to move to what one of our scenarios stated. We need to move to a sort of a wise tortoise kind of scenario, where we're actually planning from a holistic way, a systematic way. We actually have a strong citizen's voice. We have people, the community is actually engaged rather than just simply being a recipient of knowledge. It's actually engaging in the conversation around it. And the worst possible thing we could do in South Africa is to create areas where we're competing. So the greedy jackal scenario needs to be avoided at all costs, because we're all in this together. And of course the other one is we have the ostrich scenario, where we stick our heads in the sand and kind of hope that someone else comes along and solves our problem. So I think that's where, the message is really about a water-wise society that's sort of enlightened. So I just want to leave you with the final thought. With any crisis comes opportunities for innovation. It's just the way sometimes you look at things. So I think we're going to have a lot more discussions around the opportunities and the possibilities, reuse, recycling, the yuck factor, how do societies adapt to this change, and how do they engage and sort of take these new ideas forward. So I think with that, that's my thoughts in terms of the water sector. Thank you.